When I talk about abuse in this video, I'll be using a rather broad definition. Mild versions of the same toxic behavior will obviously not reach the level of actual abuse, but still belong to the same pattern, and patterns are what we're interested in this series. Also, a heckin' trigger warning for like abuse and other unpleasant subjects, so viewers' discretion is advised. The base nature and causes of abuse are the same regardless of the abuser's or the victim's gender. It consists of hurting people, disrespecting consent, making people feel uncomfortable and unsafe, etc., and is generally caused by unmanaged bad mental health, which can include having a history of being victimized oneself. Dangerous women are harder to spot than dangerous men. Women are taught to deceive you into trusting them. They adhere to default politeness and feel the need to keep up appearances, making dangerous women harder to tell apart from the normal ones. Also, women are not taught about their ability to hurt others, or at least not in any way that would make them see it as a bad thing, neither by their gender role nor by their victims. So they're often less aware of what behavior may be hurtful to begin with, unlike a lot of men post-feminism who at least tend to have a baseline awareness of, hey, this thing hurts other people, so it's not socially permissible to do this anymore. This means that genuinely kind men and those who may not be kind but at least care enough about not being seen as a creep know what behaviors to avoid. The only traditionally creepy men that are left are those who don't know how to act normal, due to a lack of that self-control. In combination with the increased awareness around male abuse patterns thanks to feminism, this makes them and their red flags fairly easy to spot a mile away and hopefully avoid. Matriarchy also avoids blame for its actions. Gender roles dismiss and infantilize women, essentially asserting they couldn't do any real harm to begin with. Often, patriarchy is used to divert blame away from female abusers because it's not so bad when a woman does it, because patriarchy. Like in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, the female protagonist makes a bet that even she, as a conventionally hot person, could get rid of a guy in 10 days by being clingy and crazy and horrible to him, while her target happens to make a bet that he could make a woman fall in love with him in the same time frame. Classic rom-com premise, am I right? Oh god, the straights. The only reason we're supposed to be okay with the insane abuse this woman does to him during the movie is because he wins the bet in the end, re-establishing his patriarchal dominance over her. And I mean, she was obviously only pretending to be an uncaring asshole. Very sane person behavior to pretend to abuse a stranger for over a week. That's definitely a safe person to get into a relationship with. Abusive women also often claim victimhood in order to displace blame, including onto their own victims. Examples may include people like Amber Heard accusing Johnny Depp of domestic abuse when really she was the one abusing him, or TERFs accusing trans people of being abusive to cis women when they themselves are the ones being hateful bigots, scapegoating a tiny minority group that has nothing to do with them or their cis male abusers. Matriarchal power differs from patriarchal power, so do abuse patterns. A lot of them are based in the respective comfort zone areas. Like, did you know that healthcare jobs are among the most cited professions of female serial killers? The movie Misery, based on the Stephen King novel of the same name, is about a writer who is imprisoned by a serial killer nurse who likes his book series and is not happy about him trying to end it and change genres. The protagonist only realizes as the movie progresses that she is not, in fact, a good Samaritan who simply rescued him from his car crash and offered to treat his injuries while waiting out the snowstorm, but that she is in fact keeping him prisoner and that she will likely kill him if he does not comply with her requests. He doesn't start out suspecting her of evil intent because we are taught to trust and let our guard down around female caregivers. She also knows how to act polite and presentable, only dropping that mask during occasional angry outbursts before immediately recomposing herself. This is why it is only after she herself literally reveals in another fit of anger that she is keeping him prisoner and help isn't coming that he tries to escape. The articles about actual female serial killers that I looked at for this bit talked about how in most of the cases they examined, the killers worked in stereotypically female professions like nurses or babysitters. They also pointed out that female serial killers tend to target specifically vulnerable people, including those closest to them and in their care, whether that is the ill, the elderly, or children, and usually kill by means that will make it look like a natural death, like poison or asphyxiation, so it's harder for them to be suspected of the murders. Interestingly, they also noted that in most of the cases they looked at, the perpetrator was of and I quote, above average physical attractiveness, which they theorized may have helped them gain their victims' trust. Men abuse physically, women abuse metaphysically. Women engage in mostly verbal and emotional abuse rather than sexual and physically violent abuse like men do. Both gender roles can obviously also do the other kind, but this is their default. Women often also abuse indirectly or assist others in their abuse, as per the assisting others part of their gender role that we have previously talked about. Men claim their victim's body while women claim their victim's space. Body access is reserved for family members and partners, but they alone tend to be targeted by male domestic abuse. Domestic abuse by women extends to anyone who shares a space with them. My domestic abusers were my cis-female housemates. I think I'm going to read this next part, not because it's absolutely impossible to do it, just because I think it's going to be better for me to get through this portion fast, so... My domestic abusers were my cis-female housemates. The first two were U-Haul lesbians who both had prior diagnoses whose management deteriorated significantly over lockdown. They became hoarders who made our living room unusable for the better part of a year. They'd loudly fight with each other whenever they were home and awake, often until well past midnight or early in the morning, terrorizing me and the neighbors as collateral damage. And they'd yell at me in our group chat if I ever complained about anything, making me unable to use Instagram for like 6 months straight until they finally moved out and I got my friend to block and delete them off the app for me. The landlady's niece moved in after them, who was like the opposite extreme, a clean freak with fucking something undiagnosed she refused to see a professional about. And she was somehow so much worse. She didn't let me use the communal storage in the kitchen and would move my stuff around without my permission, including to places I could not find it in a hurry. She'd leave open her room door or sit in the kitchen all day to watch her shows, making me dread leaving my room for food or the bathroom, because I wouldn't be able to do so unnoticed. She'd come complain to me if I talked to my friends on Discord, behind the closed door of my own room at a normal volume and a reasonable time of evening, mind you, because she got up at 5 a.m. for no good reason, despite not having worked the vast majority of the time. And I couldn't complain about her because she was the landlady's fucking niece. I lived with that woman for like 3 days before deciding to move out after all, as soon as humanly possible. It ended up taking like 3 weeks of that terror to do so. Like, she was horrible. It's suddenly so easy when you can just read a thing off. That's crazy. I would almost get through this like so fast if I could just do this for the whole thing. Ugh. Can you imagine? Imagine having a teleprompter. They held more power than me in our shared spaces and used those spaces against me, taking away the safety of my own home, living space, my online living space, and my ability to fulfill my basic needs like food, social contacts, health, and even sleep at times, without ever laying a finger on me. Domestic abuse stats don't even mention this kind of abuse. Apparently in the UK, the government only recognizes domestic abuse by family members and partners, even though the people on the ground know that that is not all there is. Most stats barely scratch LGBT plus domestic abuse as a concept, let alone a higher risk of it. They only ever mention family and partners, not roommates, and only ever focus on physical and sexual abuse, no verbal, emotional, or space-based abuse, territorial abuse. Male abuse seeks stuff like wealth, sex, and violence. These are the means of superiority over other men, the means to climb the patriarchal hierarchy and defend your spot. Wealth, the metric of professional success, economic desirability, the ability to own your desires. Sex, the approval of women or the power to take it from them if not freely given. The ability to spawn heirs to continue your name and legacy. Violence, the means of subduing anyone who would challenge you. To be the ultimate dominator, the alpha chad at the top of the food chain. Female abuse seeks attention, virtue, and control. These are the means of superiority over other women, symbols of your achievement and your matriarchal status. Attention, because you're the prettiest, the most popular, the one to be envied, the best performer. Virtue, because you deserve the most empathy, the most approval. You own the moral high ground. You are pure and clean and perfect. Control, because that is the highest achievement on the matriarchy. Control over yourself and your image. Control to assure your safety and security. Control over men. Control over your fellow women. Control over the next generation. Control over life itself. To become unto God herself. Men feel entitled to external things, including other people's bodies, for self-serving reasons. Like, you generally need a second body for sex, so while it is shitty, it at least makes some level of logical sense to unconsensually involve other people in it. Women do not serve their individual selves, they serve matriarchy at large. As there is less of a differentiation between the individual self and the matriarchal identity than there is in PvP patriarchy. To serve matriarchy is still to serve and center yourself, or so it would like you to think, because you and the rest of womankind are one and the same after all. If the others bring shame on themselves, they bring shame on matriarchy, and by that, all of you. Therefore, women feel entitled to their in-group as if they're an extension of themselves. Like, TERFs aren't out here weathering against trans masks getting top surgery because they really wanted to touch some titty. They're doing it because they feel we shouldn't corrupt our female form, like, as a concept. Girl, I didn't ask for a female form. This is me returning the goods that were faulty, okay? This is me returning the wrong order, okay? And it's not just the TERFs. How often has another woman had an unsolicited opinion on your body or looks or lifestyle or fertility choices? They're acting like they should get a say in what other people do with their bodies, even though they themselves have no vested interest in those bodies. Matriarchy is informal and unofficial about things, so it is harder to put effective safeguards in place in it. In patriarchy, they merely need to be made official to be able to be enforced. In a job environment these days, you can go complain to HR if your boss is a discriminatory dickhead, and sue them if they breach policy. But what do you do if that happens with, say, the instructor at a class you're taking as a hobby? There's no one to complain to, no higher authority to enforce rules, so you just have to deal with it or leave. Matriarchy is informal to the point of making even the impersonal personal. This could be making something that isn't about them, about themselves, but also, for example, expecting emotional investment and loyalty in impersonal interactions and relationships. Matriarchy is highly invested in denying its own existence. If matriarchal power existed, it would make it harder to play the frail yet virtuous victim, ever innocent and exempt from blame. Unlike patriarchy, which is obsessed with its own hierarchy because it is mobile and a core tenet of their nonsense, matriarchy also loves to gaslight everyone about not having a hierarchy, despite definitely having one. We're all one and the same here after all. How could anyone hold more power than her sister, even if she is, better at this? But hey, everyone's still part of the club. Activist movements, including but not limited to feminism, often refuse to acknowledge a social hierarchy within the in-group in an effort to equalize everyone. Acknowledging power and privilege would be counter to the victimhood focus necessary for self-advocacy, as Tommaso wonderfully demonstrated in the first part of the series. Wait, what? And we don't want to invalidate anyone or make them feel bad after all, even if they full well know where they stand compared to others. Like, we can pretend that stuff like class, passing, dysphoria, skin tone, level of access needs, intersectionality, and so many other factors don't have a significant impact on people's experiences within their in-group, but at the end of the day, we all know our lived experiences say otherwise. And the only times it is talked about, it seems to only ever be done in a victim-oppressor binary, as if, again, marginalized people who hold privilege in another aspect suddenly no longer count as marginalized people in their own right, or as if the more marginalized only ever get to be passive victims, not empowered people of their own. Neither of which is productive. This attempt at forcefully equalizing everyone neglects to acknowledge that the other purpose of hierarchy is to safeguard those less powerful from catastrophic failure. You don't send a civilian into a fight meant for Superman. They will fucking die. It betrays a lack of acknowledgement and management of the psychological hazard that activism and social work pose to their in-group, and who within it is most at risk and in need of safeguarding from it. Activism exploits its in-group for its agenda. I'll be using a lot of trans examples as that is my personal activism background, but these are highly transferable ideas across different movements. There's a pressure to be an activist, to volunteer or work for free, merely because you're in-group. Because if you don't do it yourself, no one else will. Allies don't exist, obviously. Those are a myth, don't you know that? Ugh. Community and support spaces are confounded with the political movement. Vulnerable people who came there for support are instead recruited to the front lines of the fight for their freedom. Often they're young and inexperienced with nowhere else to turn and not much else going on in their lives. A void that yearns to be filled with something, anything meaningful to do. I mean, how many activists of history have been shockingly young when you see their age at the end of the movie about their life? I got into charity work when I was 22, fresh out of uni, unemployed with a straining injury that made my qualification useless. Even if there had been jobs in it, which there weren't, still early transition and highly dysphoric, stuck on waiting lists, and living in a city that I didn't know anyone in. I tried to avoid complete social isolation by attending the local trans and queer groups. I ended up being railroaded into participating in any un- or low-paid study, podcast interview, whatnot else someone needed willing non-binary participants for, and doing unpaid social work at various charities that I was not qualified for. I used too much activism as a form of self-harm, as many of us did and do, and I was enabled and encouraged in that behavior with no semblance of concern for its effects on me. A friend I knew from those circles died of suicide in 2021. I was involved in a lot of community stuff at the time, but they were doing way more than me or anyone else we knew. And I firmly believe it is one of the things that killed them in the end. Activism-related social work often happens outside of traditional social work contexts, or is otherwise performed by not social work qualified people, whether that is the relevant exploited in-group or women of the relevant context. Another trans friend and I at times single-handedly led a major charity's 18+ peer support group for 2 years through the pandemic. Both of us were unpaid volunteers without any social work background, moderating a Discord server of vulnerable adults who already don't do well, doing even worse than usual, ourselves as in-group included. This all happened with minimal supervision from our relevant youth worker, who themselves was in-group and whose original degree was not in social work either. Which is not to discredit them, their work, or their training since, just to say they too sidestepped into that sector for in-group reasons, not from a social work background. That charity, because it is ultimately a good one, is now seemingly discontinuing that group entirely because they have finally figured out that unsupervised peer group support, let alone a 24/7 Discord that cannot be reasonably moderated, was a bad idea. Good. I'm glad. As another example, the people who are helping people get into the media industry with training and opportunities and stuff, the industry with maybe the most disproportionately shitty work conditions for what the work actually is, as opposed to construction or something where there's actual danger for the average worker, tend to be cis women from the media industry, not from a social work background. The people they're helping include diverse talent in dire need of safeguarding in such a harsh environment, yet they are not social workers. No proper qualification is needed because being in group or being woman is considered enough. Women, even of the outgroup, because apparently doing social work without proper training is the female equivalent of men going, I can do that, even when they definitely can't. Except that men usually only endanger themselves with their hubris. Women in a carer position endanger their charges more so than themselves by doing this. I trusted some of those media cis women with my safeguarding instead of taking my own precautions in the good faith belief that they knew what they were doing, seeing as this was, their whole literal job. And the ones in question didn't. And because of that, my mental health, that had finally been stable for months, was damaged to the point of even impacting my physical health too. I've just decided that we're going to read bad experiences off because I don't want to fucking talk about it. Which is, once again, not to say that this happens to everyone in their care or with every industry cis woman trying to help. I've met plenty of lovely ones that didn't give me psychic damage, but there is a significant risk to vulnerable adults here that is not being adequately reduced due to a lack of regulations typical of media industry. My mother and sister are both trained social workers. I can confirm that while it may not be everything, proper training is very much necessary to safely do a job where you are faced with some of the most miserable experiences humans can have on a regular basis. Safeguarding people, it's important. In activist spaces, too much responsibility is often given way too freely to unqualified, vulnerable in-group recruits as well, endangering not only their charges but also themselves. In-group spaces are inherently a higher risk for their members due to the shared subject trauma. There were incidents during my time in charity work where I could not protect people, or I ended up making things worse for myself and others because I was in a position of responsibility I should not have been in. And now that I've left that sector behind, I end up hesitating to take on responsibility that I am actually qualified for. Like that last job that I had to quit after a week, it was a social media job. I have a decade of experience in that, yet they hired me in a junior role at barely above living wage. And I did not even question that until weeks after quitting. Because media industry loves to brainwash you into believing that new entrants deserve nothing and that any media experience gained outside of traditional industry doesn't count. Because unlike the charity sector, capitalism hates giving people responsibility because that would mean having to actually pay them. Like, I feel like, at least in my case, this shitty volunteering background only ended up reinforcing this thing that women and other marginalized people do, where we hesitate to apply to jobs unless we're fully qualified, or to ask for a pay rise, or to trust ourselves that we are capable enough to do the thing ourselves. All this imposter syndrome, default settling for less, damsel in distress stuff that ends up reinforcing things like the gender pay gap. Matriarchy lures with the carrot rather than punishing with the stick. It promises you everything you want in return for pledging yourself to its service. Do not trust movements or systems or industries that promise you your dreams because they're likely just looking to exploit you. Don't you want valor and heroism? Why don't you become a soldier? Don't you want glitz and glamour? Why don't you work in the film industry? Don't you want freedom and equality? Why don't you become an activist? No one else is going to do it after all. These movements are happy to sacrifice the very people they claim to fight for as expendable cannon fodder to the cause. The most recent example in mainstream feminism would be stuff like people of the matriarchal ingroup pressuring other ingroup members into speaking up about their sexual assault experiences, framing it as a moral duty to their fellow women, even if it would be detrimental to their own mental health, career, and life, while likely bringing little to no consequences for their abuser or even feminism at large. There's this idea of notably women only ever being traumatized into competence. You see it again and again in media with tropes like the final girl or the more recent good for her genre. It's the idea of scrappiness taken to an unhealthy extreme and beyond reasonable application. It expresses this very black-pilled feminist belief that there is no solution, no progress, no way for women to get confidently skilled at something or empowered without starting from nothing and learning it the hardest way possible. The goal is no longer to actually break down and overcome the limitations of the female gender role to make things easier for themselves and others, but to become empowered in spite of them, to do it while upholding the woman victim status quo. Because if women achieved patriarchal privilege without being a struggling victim of it, she would become implicated by it the same as men are. She would lose the moral high ground. She could be blamed. She needs adversity as a justification for using and abusing her power. Sometimes the thought is not all that counts, and even the best of intentions can be unknowingly used for evil. I don't think that makes the people doing these things inherently bad, nor does it make the things they do okay. Matriarchy perverts women's kindness by giving them status for it and then demolishing the person underneath until it is all they have left, and the idea and image of being kind become more important to them than its genuine selfless practice. Their kindness is no longer in the best interest of the people they help. It is a matriarchal duty, and as soon as that duty is satisfied, the self-centeredness will kick back in. Matriarchy discourages in-group PvP in a direct sense, but it also hides plenty of sanctioned in-group violence in its policing. You shouldn't hate another woman on principle. You may only hate men on principle. Unless, of course, that woman has done something wrong, in which case you may use whatever force you deem necessary to violently re-educate her into submission. For the cause! This form of violence is not considered PvP because the result is not an interpersonal win-lose state. It is just done in service of matriarchy, not in service of the individual like patriarchal PvP. Strange Eons was recently talking about the Tumblr and 4chan wars of the early 2010s or whatever, and about how Tumblr was too busy infighting to pay attention to, let alone indulge 4chan's provocations like they were expecting them to. The infighting happens in service of the overarching mission, in this case that of building an all-inclusive safe space on their own platform, not the platform's status in comparison to others. Raids like what 4chan was trying to provoke of them would require outward attention and a desire to interact with external parties and spread their beliefs outside of their own group, which Tumblr's mission simply did not require. Discouraging in-group PvP by only allowing the sanctioned kind means that matriarchal lessers can't fight back against their in-group oppressors as easily or fiercely as they can against out-group oppressors. Therefore, they may actually seek out hostile environments because there they can fight back when mistreated. A decent number of the few AFAB people I have seen in the camera and general tech department are very butch presenting. Production and marketing tend to have more expressional diversity, and hair and makeup and costume tend to be quite femme-dominated.
Maybe cameras are just less interesting to the femmes and makeup to the butches. I don't know.
There are plenty of femmes that know how to use a camera, as we know from the internet, and plenty of masculine hair and makeup and costume to be done on sets.
Well, you said male-dominated jobs require aesthetic limitations. Maybe the femmes just feel they cannot express themselves in the camera department.
Camera, unlike stuff like construction, is actually not that rough or dirty for the most part, and either way it doesn't keep you from having long hair or wearing makeup. So most regular femme cis-het women that I've seen around industry would be fine aesthetically. It's the parts of the matriarchal in-group who were given the short end of the stick under both matriarchy and patriarchy who, when presented with the choice between being oppressed by fellow women they do not relate to but feel forced matriotic loyalty to, or being oppressed by cis men they can easily complain about if they get out of line, will choose the latter. Outgroup PvP, so in this case manhate, is all women are allowed, barring self-harm, so that is what all the rage will be channeled into. This, once again, extends to marginalized groups too. The outgroup can't possibly be trusted. They're the privileged, the oppressor, the enemy, after all. People feel they don't need to hold back when it comes to their outgroup, regardless of the outgroup individual's alignment to their cause. Being in-group makes you the ultimate authority on your subject. Being outgroup makes you inherently less knowledgeable about it, and thereby disqualifies you from having an opinion. If someone from the outgroup dares touch an in-group topic, they will be bashed and silenced regardless of how informed or supportive they may be. This is a silencing tactic to uphold the victimhood status quo and an unfair distrust and dismissal of allies. Educated allies can be trusted, often more so than inexperienced in-group. Like, I trust my cis loved ones who've listened to me ramble on and watched me transition for years to better represent my interests in my absence than some freshly out baby trans who only and barely knows about their own experience. Allies are an incredibly useful resource if one makes proper use of them. For example, they can be charged with a lot of the legwork to lessen the in-group's burden. I've utilized allies to help me come out to people I don't talk to on a regular basis, or to correct people for me if they witness someone misgendering me. I've made resources for allies, like my How to Draw All the Gender series from a few years ago, to enable cis creators to make baseline decent trans rep so that genderqueer creators like myself can focus on more complex rep that no one but us would be able to make. This is even more important for the intersectional members of various in-groups because they will inherently have more stuff on their plate. Antagonizing allies is never productive. How many men out there have been deterred from feminism because of the blatant man-hate? How much more could have already been achieved with their help? Trans masks and butch cis women get more shame and dismissal than straight-up man-hate because of the in-group PvP not being allowed. Transphobia from cis women against trans masks is usually just misgendering, because they don't even take our gender seriously enough to weather against it. They're dismissing us as women and traitors, rather than being mad at us for trying to appropriate manhood like they are doing to the trans women with womanhood. Meanwhile, AMAP people get vicious hate. Like, cis women can be hyper shitty to feminine cis men. At least with trans femmes, there is usually a level of presentability breaks in place because they're more explicitly in group. There is more hesitation and second thoughts from the average cis woman. Well, you can't just weather against a fellow woman. Well, at least they're not a man. Even the actual abuse directed against trans femmes is often more like a welcoming punishment, like a deeply abusive sorority hazing ritual for new recruits, rather than outgroup bashing. Oh, you think you want to be a woman? Well, let me show you. Let me treat you like shit, like I have been treated like shit. Let me shame you out of mannish behavior, like I have been shamed out of mannish behavior. Like, there is affirmation in it. If a cis woman yells at you to show her your dick because you're a trans woman and she's trying to other you with that, there is affirmation in being able to say, I don't have one of those anymore. The abuse functions as pressure to conform to the female gender role. If you conform to the gender roles expected of you, you can't be abused for having the wrong ones anymore. If you were gonna get bottom surgery anyway, then that's great news and all the more reason to get it done quickly. Cis women's abuse doesn't deter trans women from being women, as some TERFs might want you to think. It pressures them into being more womanly. It's gender role policing. Matriarchal gender role policing brings you in rather than kick you out. It rewards conformity with less violence and more empathy. Patriarchy has violence as part of its conformity and will only take some of it away when you behave antisocially like it taught you to.
Well, yeah, but it's different if it's a man. Those femboys are just dressing feminine because they're trying to manipulate cis women into having sex with them so they can abuse them.
What Twitter gunk hole did you pull that take out of?
Oh, just representing the girl blogging femcel core, female manipulator constituents, all part of the job.
Okay, so being a female manipulator is cool and good and fine, actually, but God forbid a non-woman tries to be pretty enough to get laid. Okay, Jan. Also, cis men actively dress less femme than they would like to appeal to straight women. We've been over this in my men's video. What on earth are you talking about? Y'all showing your whole ass of female gaze kink shit out there. Like, find yourself a toxic sissy to consensually take whatever this is out on. Leave the internet femboys alone. You lunatics. Unsurprisingly, when you find a man-hating reactionary online, you usually don't have to scroll very far through her content to find some TERF dog whistles or transphobic implications. Now, I won't name or show any of the real-life examples of this that I have stumbled across before, because I don't want to accuse anyone of transphobia. But just like, I don't know, imagine like a young white cis woman in e-girl makeup cackling at an Andrew Tate TikTok. That's like the vibe generally, you know? And that is not to say that you shouldn't disapprove of Andrew Tate and his weird misogynist nonsense that is actively counterproductive to men's lib, let alone, you know, the crimes and all that. But just in the sense of like, that man is a very easy target for people who have underlying man-hate issues and can't take them out on normal men in a socially acceptable way, so they ridicule the manosphere lolcows instead.